So there's this ongoing debate, and it's a really good debate, on whether BookTok is a force for good or not such a force for good. And by BookTok, I don't just mean activities, literary activities on TikTok, but I also mean on social media in general, like the promotion of literature and authors on social media. Is that a good thing or not a good thing? And on the surface, I think we could all say, well, yeah, it's a good thing. Come on, it's great. Like, it promotes books and it promotes sales, and so more people are reading, and this is really important in an era when there's a lot of competition from Netflix, from gaming, and all sorts of other activities. It's great that there's a channel like BookTok that allows people to hear more about books. Great, absolutely fantastic. The other thing about this channel is that not only does it promote the visibility of literature and books, but it's also recruiting younger people, younger readers into the community of books. And so that's absolutely fantastic. I think any activity, any community needs that constant recruitment, especially of younger ages, to stay relevant and stay modern and fresh and abreast with current trends. And in this case, stay abreast of trends in the kind of books that are coming out and so on. So all in all, I think it's obviously fantastic that there is this kind of activity. But there are some drawbacks and there are some costs to this that we should consider. And in my mind, there are three main elements that we might want to consider a little bit before deepening any sort of relationship with BookTok, or kind of believing that it's the savior of literature. The first is that I'm reminded of a completely different sector, which is the wine sector. So wine was seen as being historically quite elitist. Obviously, it was something that, rich people drank wine, but other people couldn't afford it. So it was kind of a very elitist thing. And then there was an American guy who came along who was called Robert Parker. And Robert Parker became a hugely influential wine critic. I mean, this guy basically could make or break a wine. And he communicated largely through what was originally a newsletter that he was typewriting every week to his community and mailing it. It was all very quaint. The newsletter was called The Advocate, and maybe The Wine Advocate, I forget. But anyway, he would send this out, and he had a really great way, really accessible way of talking about wine that was just easier to understand than the traditional critics that had like quite a lofty jargon about wine that nobody understood. This guy could really communicate in a simple way why he thought a wine was good, why he thought a wine was bad, what it tasted like, what it smelled like, and so on. And so his community grew very rapidly, and he became immensely influential. So influential that basically his wine notation system was able to really drive or break the sales of a certain wine that he reviewed. And so, for example, his notation system was out of 100. And so if he gave a wine a grade that was above 90, i.e. he really liked this wine, some financial economic people looked at the figures, looked at the stats, and realized, wow, every wine that Robert Parker gives a 90 plus grade to in his newsletter, that wine's sales triple, right? And it's an immediate effect. As soon as Robert Parker says that a wine is at 90 plus, the sales triple, and the vineyard has to produce more wine and so on. And conversely, if he gave it like a bad grade, maybe anything below 70 or 65, the wine could really suffer financially. And so he came with an enormous amount of power. He was called into all sorts of wine conferences around the world, and he, every single word that he said, it was like the Fed chairman, everybody listened to every single word to know whether a wine would be a good wine to drink or not. And he could move the wine market, so like wine auctions started like hinging on his words and so on. So he had a really disproportionate amount of power. And there are probably some book talkers out there who today resemble that profile, who have probably an equivalent amount of power with regard to their tastes and book talk and Maybe you'll see in bookstores, bookstore chains, you'll see kind of a BookTok corner, and a certain BookTok influencer recommends these books. And those really big BookTok influencers can really drive sales. The problem with Robert Parker, and what could potentially become a problem for BookTok, is that the wine industry became wise to the fact that, hey, if Robert Parker likes your wine, your sales triple. People started wondering, well, how do I make Robert Parker like my wine? And Robert Parker had very particular tastes, and he had very, let's say, American tastes. He liked, Napa Valley wines that were quite oaky, that had certain smell profiles to them, and so on. And so around the world, wines from France or Italy or Australia or whatever started making their wines in a way that they knew would become more Parker-ish. And so the wine industry, instead of having this beautiful diversity of Australian wines, French wine, Italian wines, Spanish wines, started having this kind of increasingly convergent, similar taste profiles across the world in order to respond to Robert Parker. And so if I take that cautionary advice from the wine industry, I worry that in fact, we are going to start seeing the publishing industry converge according to the tastes of one or a few book talkers who say, you know what, I like YA a lot, and I like it when YA has dragons in it, and I like it when the dragons are blue. And suddenly you're going to see more and more books where, okay, it's going to be about YA, they're going to be dragons, and surprise, surprise, the dragons are going to be blue, because that is something that appeals to certain book talkers. And that's increasingly going to become true in this age of the algorithm, where the algorithm on BookTok or on other social media is going to figure out what works in this guy's review, what works in this BookTok profile is this comment around certain data profiles of literature. So that's something I would really worry about. The corollary of that, of course, is that book publishers know that BookTok is an influential channel and are now looking at authors' followings on TikTok or on Instagram, wherever, looking to see if they have an inbuilt audience to sell books. So now a major factor in whether an author, an aspiring author, gets published or not is, do they have 10,000 plus followers on Instagram? If yes, cool, let's talk about your book. If not, sorry buddy, the marketing is going to be a bit challenging. And that is, I think, very concerning. I can't imagine that William Faulkner or Marcel Proust would have necessarily wanted to join social media or wanted to build a following or a community online. They would have wanted to focus on the art and on the writing. And so it kind of bothers me to think that, like, wow, what's really judging an author now is whether they have a huge community. And I think that distorts the game a little bit. So the influence of certain book talkers, but also the influence of certain authors becomes a bit of a problem in terms of generating a diverse landscape of literature. And then the final point that I would add is that because there's a very commercial aspect to BookTok, i.e., if you are featured on BookTok, if you have a big community as a writer, an engaged community on social media, you will sell more. BookTok becomes a much more commercial proposition rather than a critical proposition. And so what that means is that there is maybe an unholy alliance between the publishers and certain BookTok influencers, whereby there is some remuneration, either for money or in kind or for free books or whatever. And that necessarily then translates as a sort of stealth form of advertising, that essentially book talkers become a marketing channel for the publishing industry rather than an independent assessor and critic of what is coming out. There has to be at some point some form of collusion between the publishing industry and book talkers, and that necessarily creates less diversity in terms of what's being presented to publishers, what's being approved by publishers, and that is a very problematic relationship in terms of that stealth advertising. So overall, yes, it's great that there's now a channel that's blaring loudly, like you have to read, it's cool to read. I mean, nobody's gonna go against that, and I think we should all be happy about that. But we should also ask ourselves, what are the costs to that in terms of a narrowing of the literary proposition, i.e. more books that resemble more books that are liked by a narrow set of BookTok influencers, and eventually maybe there will be one overwhelming BookTok influencer whose tastes will really define what is being published. And then are we really picking authors based on the fact of whether or not they have strong social media audiences? I mean, that's totally ridiculous. So why is marketing such an important piece of selecting and improving and publishing authors? And then the last piece of the puzzle that's problematic is this stealth advertising, which is that essentially BookTok is an advertising channel, not a critical channel, which is what it's posing as. And we should be able to make a distinction between there is a financial commercial relationship between a publisher and a BookToker versus a critic or an evaluator of that book. So those are my main points on why TikTok is not necessarily the greatest force for good for literature that you might imagine. But I'd love to hear from any of you what you think, which side of the fence you're on. What do you think about it? I mean, I know I'm part of that system, to be honest. I'm somebody who clearly has defined tastes, and maybe somewhere somebody is thinking like, oh, we have to make sure that the books that we published conform to those tastes. So I'm fully aware, but I do try as much as possible to stay as independent as possible in my assessments. And how do we ensure that there is a guardrail between that commercial relationship and those critical assessments? I'd love to hear your opinion. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to follow or subscribe this channel. And in the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.